We're going to be covering the Ties That Bind article. It's going to talk about economic interdependence. And as we talk about economic interdependence, we're going to see how the liberal literature, the liberal theory, is in support of interdependence, and how the theory of realism is going to sort of give us a little bit of a rebuttal for that. And then we're going to talk about some case studies and some methodology. When you're writing your paper, right, you have a paper coming up, and I'm going to have a separate video for that specifically. Remember that you want to follow this. What is the theory? What are the arguments? How do the arguments apply to the real world? And you're going to follow that process. And we're going to see that in the article. And this is the scientific way of approaching things. So interdependence has some conventional wisdom. We've talked about this before. It is based in liberalism, and it follows the idea that as trade increases, right, you start sharing certain resources, you start becoming reliant on each other's resources, and you then will be less likely to go to war. So how independence works, right, is that you are worried about the loss of your trade partner. And the United States is worried about Kuwait no longer being a state in the early 1990s, in 1991 and 1992. So it does not want Iraq to invade Kuwait and take over that territory. So it comes to defense, in part because of that trade partner is very valuable, that resource is very valuable. The other part is that during a conflict, there's this disruption of trade. So even if you know the other state is going to win, you might still align yourself with that state and come to its defense to shorten the conflict so that the impact on your economy is less, right? Remember, this is a rational thought process. So it's the right thing to do to step in for this other state. It's that you would rather have a military cost, say defending Kuwait, right, if we're talking about the US, then have this larger economic loss, right? The longer that the supply of oil is disrupted, the more damage to the economy. So you don't want that disruption. And then the last part is this loss of trade deals. If Kuwait knows that the United States is not going to come to its defense, then it's not going to give it as valuable of trade deals, right? It's not going to give it some special trade deal if it can't uphold, right? If Kuwait knows that the U.S. is not going to uphold its security alliances, then it won't be willing to give these trade deals. So there's a commitment issue, right? There is an economic issue, and it all comes to this rational choice, right? What is more valuable, not being in this fight or coming to the aid of another state, right? And having the security alliance through this interdependence in order to have better economic systems. So as you can tell, right, you see a clear argument from the article and from what I'm just saying is that there's a theoretical perspective that may be missing. And we're going to talk about the theory, right, that it is not conventionally tested, right? So you have this conventional wisdom, it's not being tested. And so we're going to focus first on the US and South Korean Free Trade Agreement, and we're going to use this historical experiences, these cases, right, the 4 cases that we'll talk about later in the article, right? What are they and how do they work? And then we're going to tie it to IR theory. And I think this is very important for your papers. It's very important when you're doing all this work. What is the underlying theory? What does the theory tell us about the world? And then let's look at the evidence, right? Let's use the theory to define the world so we can look at the evidence and know how we're looking at it and help us find these conclusions. So they have a data set. They're using cases over a period of time. So the 4 cases are South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan. And the period is the last quarter century. It's actually 1985 to 2007. And the argument is about asymmetrical alliances. Now here's the big part, is that the conventional wisdom was that if you share an economy, if you have interdependence, you have a lot of trade, then you're going to have a lot of peace and you're going to come together for security agreements. But if you have an asymmetrical trade, right, the US is a very large economy. For a period of time, the South Korea is a very small economy. It's still very relatively small. But when you have these really big differences. Sometimes we use this language of core and periphery, but when one is a great power and the other one's not a great power, then you have this asymmetry and it can create other issues, right? These other issues exist that so you don't have interdependence, right? France and Germany interdependent because they have a similar size economy. The US, right, and South Korea do not have similar sizes in their economy, and so the trade balance is asymmetrical, right? The US being very large and South Korea very small. So you don't have reciprocity, you're not as dependent on each other, and this can cause a lot of issues. And so when they're talking about specifically these East Asian cases, there are a lot of things that we want to concern ourselves with. Okay, I don't know why the title isn't showing up, but this is a roadmap paragraph, and let me just type in here. I apologize, it should have been loading. So a roadmap paragraph is something that I want all of you to have in your papers. And what a roadmap paragraph does is you write an introduction, a paragraph or two about what you're going to cover in the article, and then you need a roadmap paragraph. And some people don't like a roadmap paragraph. I do. I would like you to write it because what it does is it helps you sort of explain what's happening. And so a roadmap paragraph, even though your paper is very short, I want this to be about 4 sentences where you say step by step. I'm going to do this in the paper, and then I'm going to do that in the paper, and then I'm going to follow through. And if you write this after the body, right? Remember this, the strategy that I gave earlier is write the body of the paper, and then write the intro and the conclusion after you've written the body of the paper. So this is very clear. If you look at this, this is from page 209, right? They followed a process where they showed you how the argument was going to lay out, right? They're going to go through the theory, and then they're going to go through these cases, and then they're going to make these arguments, and then they find these offerings and implications. So as we'll see, maybe you don't fit with this exactly, but you'd be better off writing the body, realizing where you're going with this, and then writing the roadmap, and then the body goes off from where you expected, and then having to rewrite it. So I think it's a good practice. You still want an outline, you still want to know what you're going to cover, but I would always write an intro and conclusion last, because you don't know if you find some article and it sort of puts you off in a direction, or as you're writing, you notice that you naturally drift into a different sort of minor tangent in your writing. So you always want to make sure that you leave yourself that room by writing the body first. Here we can follow from what they're saying the structure of the paper, but they needed to know what the paper was going to be before they wrote this roadmap paragraph. And by having this roadmap paragraph, you can see, am I making a cohesive argument? Because if in 3 or 4 sentences you can't say, here's what I'm going to cover, then it's not clear what you actually covered in your body. And the body of your paper needs to be very clear. What are the arguments? How are you making them? What is the order in which you're doing it? So they start with a theory, right? I think all of you should do this. You're going to take you have a topic that you picked, but I want all of you to start with a theory. What theory is important for your topic, right? And here they're very clear, right? They say, okay, well, you have the liberal interdependence, but what does realism say? And realism creates this argument that allies will just naturally trade more with each other, right? One of the things is that we think, oh, interdependence, economic trading means more peace and more getting along, but it might be that the chronology is out of order, right? That you have peace and you have these allies, and because they're allies, you're willing to trade more. Firms, right? A company is willing to invest in an ally before someone where there's some sort of risk of conflict, right? If you're a corporation in the United States, you're much more likely to invest in some sort of business in the United Kingdom or France or Western Europe than you are in sub-Saharan Africa, because the risks are very different, right? You have a higher likelihood that you're going to get a return on investment in those areas because you don't know what sort of conflicts are in other areas, right? That's why you won't see a lot of firms, US firms going into Iran. You will not see US firms going into North Korea because there's that political risk. What if it falls apart? Or what if the other country just has a conflict in general, right? You want to make sure that you have that. So that chronology matters, and really I'm saying, well, it might not be that economic dependence or economic trade causes peace. It may that be that those states that already have peace and that are allied, right, they're just going to trade more with each other. And the other part is that non-great powers are going to start worrying about over-reliance. And we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about South Korea. South Korea is the name of South Korea is what we call the state, but the official name of South Korea is the Republic of Korea. So it's going to come up a few times. Republic of Korea is South Korea. And the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK, is North Korea. You can always look this up. I'm using it in the notes, so when you're going through the notes, if you see ROK, that's Republic of Korea. So if you're a weak state, or not necessarily a weak state, but just a smaller state, right? South Korea is a smaller state in its economy and its military and its landmass. So it's going to worry about over-reliance. Am I too reliant on the U.S.? And if I am so reliant on the U.S. in my economy and my security matters, then that puts me at risk. So if you're the weak state, you want to make allowances. You want to make sure that you can still protect yourself. And so even if you have a really high level of trade, you still don't want to let another country be responsible for your security, right? If you're a state, you're worried about survival. So if you're worried about survival, you don't want to have to rely on someone else for that survival. You want to build up your own military and your own defense. The other side of this is that great powers don't really want to be in a position where they create a way for a small state to drag them into a big conflict, right? This happens actually in Korea. Historically, it happens in Korea, right? You have North and South Korea, they're having a conflict. US troops are pushed down south. They eventually come back up. They come back all the way up to the northern part of North Korea, but they get close enough that then China comes in. So this conflict, even though it's part of the Cold War, right, it's a South Korean conflict. The US gets involved, right, and then China gets involved. And this is entrapment, right? You don't want the small state dragging your big, great power into a conflict. It's very, very costly. So rational choice, cost versus benefit, right? The costs are very, very high if this small state drags you into a conflict that you don't want to be in. The same thing with Syria, right? The Russians want to be involved in Syria. The United States wants to be involved in Syria. Syria sides with the Russians because, right, Russia is going to support the Assad regime, right? They're not calling for all of these human rights declarations or the end of the Assad regime. So there's all of these things happening, right? But the US doesn't want to be involved. So even though it had been training rebel groups, right, it sort of detaches itself from that because it doesn't want to be dragged into that conflict. The other part is if you're providing military security, right, the more that a great power covers part of your security, the more demands it will make. So the US is making a lot of demands of Kuwait. It makes a lot of demands of Egypt and of Israel. And because it provides a lot of security agreements, a lot of economic advantage, right, it has influence and leverage over those states. So the great powers want to demand more and more, but if they're demanding more and more, then those smaller states are going to say, wait, we're at a limit. So even though we're trading a lot, I'm not going to give you more influence over my government, right? So I'm not willing to trade my government control for you to provide security. So realism gives us a lot of real arguments, a lot of arguments that are very valid as why interdependence won't work. And then we're going to talk about these two cases of Japan and South Korea, the Republic of Korea. And they're really driven, right? This underlying issue is this low cost of automobile exports, right? So as they start to first talk about this, one of the things that is very important is that you have an economic shift. And when you see an economic shift, we sort of expect certain things to happen. So when we're going over this article, I want to make sure that we're noticing those things that'll matter now because of the security issues, but at the end of the semester, the last few weeks when we do international political economy, that they should really matter for that aspect as well. And I want to introduce some terms that will not be tested in exam 3, but I want to start getting used to because they're going to be part of the final exam. So let's look at how we're going to do this empirically, right? I always say no normative arguments when empirical arguments. So, right, their empirical evaluation is to say, okay, here are the ways that we would see interdependence working. And if interdependence is not working that way, then we can start saying these cases don't really fit. So the way that they expect interdependence to work is if your economic ties increase, then your security allowance decreases. And if your economic ties decrease, then your security allowance decreases. Or in the case, in like this other case, right, that economic shifts don't change security alliances. Because maybe you have a bad economy, but your security alliances hold, right? But it should go up, right? Economy and security should go up together, they should go down together, or the security alliances should just hold as economy moves. Because economy is going to fluctuate a lot more than security policy. Right? Defense policy holds for a year or two, right? Economic issues are day to day, right? A financial crisis could hit us tomorrow, right? We're all living in this COVID-19 world, right? Likely we will see the economy have skips and starts, right? As we start to come out of this quarantine, right, in the next 60 days, right, when everything's sort of getting back to normal, we're going to have a lot of shifts in economy. So you're going to have these ups and downs, but the security ties should remain for longer periods of time. The other part is this idea of deviant cases. So they don't really talk about this, but I want to get into this, how the science of this works. So you can have a deviant case and the theory still be fine, right? If you had 200 states, right? 200 countries, 200 states, and 198 of them follow the same policy, then those two last cases, they don't prove anything, right? A lot of times we have this mistake, like in our population, in the U.S. population, this mistaken belief that if there's one case that doesn't fit, then the rule's wrong. But that's not how science works, right? We like this 95th percentile behavior, right? So if 95% of the cases fit, then the theory fits, right? That's usually the argument we have. So this threshold, this never has to be 100%. So you can have exceptions to the rule. We'll talk about this when we talk about Taiwan, right? Because Taiwan's not a state. So you can have exceptions to the rule, but there might be a reason that's an exception to the rule versus a theory being flawed, right? Realism, liberalism, constructivism, all very mainstream theories, all very valid arguments, right? But they also have deviant cases. So are they bad theories? Do they need to be modified? Or they're just cases that don't really fit and there are reasons they don't fit? And so remember to approach this empirically. And the empirical argument here is that this top part here, right, the observations that support independence, we should see them according to conventional wisdom, but when we look at the 4 cases in East Asia, we're not going to see support for that. So how do we measure interdependence? Remember, we want to approach it scientifically, so we need some way to measure this. And they use a very clear quantitative measure, a numerical measure, and their bilateral trade volume. So when we're talking about this, right, remember that we're doing this in a quantitative way, so we're trying to find a number for this. So what they did is they took the total amount of exports and imports between the two countries, whether it be the US and Japan or US and South Korea. You have these exchanges, right? The trade between those two countries. And today it's a little more complex because you might ship something from South Korea to Canada to be finished assembled, and then from Canada to the United States. So there are factors there that are difficult to track. Then we take, okay, what are all the exports and imports? So if we're talking about the US, what percentage of our total economy is imports from South Korea? So the US has a massive economy, so the percentage is never going to be that high. But if we look at South Korea or Taiwan or the Philippines, the percentage of imports that are coming from the US and going into the Philippine economy can be quite high. So that percentage of GDP, right, that total, what percentage of the total economy is part of this bilateral trade? And that shows us how interdependent the two economies are, right? If it's 5, 10%, that's actually quite high, which means 5 to 10% of the economy relies on another state. The other indicator they use is the percent of states' international commerce. So how much of a state's global trade is just with that country? And because we're only using in all of the cases we're using the U.S. as one of the countries, right? It's U.S. Japan, U.S. South Korea, U.S. Philippines, and U.S. Taiwan. So this percentage of their total international trade is very important. You're saying how big of a trade partner is that state, right? The U.S. is going to be a very large trade partner for a lot of states, but to the US, right, South Korea and Taiwan, they're very, very small trade partners because it's an asymmetrical relationship, right? The US economy is so much larger that a loss of a Taiwanese trade partnership would be minimal to the American economy, but it would be massive to the Taiwanese economy. So we want to make sure we're hitting all of those, right? What are the number of trade partners? How significant are those trade partners? And then something the article mentions is this idea of a vital resource. Every industrialized country needs oil to run its industries, right? To run its economy. If you lose access to oil, your economy collapses. Oh, sorry about that. There's no way to avoid this. You need oil. If you're a very large population in a small territory without a lot of agriculture, then rice is also a very important tool, right? So Japan and South Korea import American rice because there's just not a great way to make enough at a low cost. And so the United States produces a lot of agricultural products and they want to sell those products everywhere. So in order to get a good deal, right, you have this vital resource that South Korea says, okay, I want to have some trade with you that will allow me to have more of this vital resources, this food that I need to feed my population, and that's going to matter for us in our interdependence. So it matters more than other things because they need it for their economy and for their population. So let's talk about the first case. The first case is South Korea. South Korea historically goes through this process that you see a couple of states in East Asia go through. We call it import substitution industrialization. So in the history of South Korea, what they do is they are building textiles, and textiles is just like cloth and fabrics and right clothes and sweaters and whatever else they're doing with fabrics. So textiles is the making of fabrics, and then maybe a little bit of turning into clothes, but mostly just making fabrics. And so what they do is they put in really harsh practices in the textile industry to make sure that that's making a lot of money. And then they take that money, right? The government taxes textiles, and they take some of that money from the textiles industry and they help support infant industry. And by infant industry, I mean industry that wouldn't be able to survive in the global economy without government help. So there was a car company that most of you will never hear of. It was very short-lived. It was South Korean. It was called Daewoo. So Daewoo starts as a South Korean automobile industry as a company. And the government helps subsidize this company until it's ready to be introduced to the international market, right? So what it does is it raises the cost of foreign cars and it lowers the cost of making this vehicle. So the industry takes off, and then up until about 1990, but we have a different cutoff period, it eventually becomes a very profitable market, and then it starts sending these automobiles worldwide, right? And if you were an adult in the early 2000s, right, South Korean and Japanese cars, right, they were cheaper. South Korea joins this market that Japan had been in since the late 80s, where you could make a cheaper vehicle in South Korea or Japan or wherever, and then sell it to the US, right? And why the East Asian companies were selling small, affordable vehicles. The American car companies were still selling very expensive, very extravagant vehicles. So there were markets there, right? Which isn't really the point of this article, but it gives you this backstory about all of a sudden South Korea really grows in its GDP. It's really going very rapidly, but the trade is in decline because of this what's called this relative change, right? We talked about relative power, right, versus absolute. So you have a relative decline in trade. You're actually doing more trading with the US, right? South Korea is doing more trading with the US between 86 and 95, but its economy is growing even faster than that. So it's a growing economy that has a little more trade, but not on par with its economic growth. So this is about interdependence, but what we see between 87 and 93 is that trade is in decline, but the security alliance holds. So it doesn't really negate or fight either argument, right? Is interdependence stronger or is realism stronger? We don't really see this. In 94, we see a bit of an argument against interdependence because South Korea suddenly, in 1997, you have a Asian financial crisis. So South Korea becomes more dependent on the US, right? But you don't really have the security shift that you would expect, right? You have increasing dependence, but you don't have increasing security alliance. And then 2001 to 2007, you have this rift between the United States and the Republic of Korea. And Republic of Korea is not part of the Axis is Evil, right? The slides are just notes so we can follow along. In 2002, right? Yes, in 2002, during the first Bush administration, the president identifies North Korea and Iran as sort of this axis of evil, that it's sort of going against them. This is a post 9/11 era, right? Bush is coming out against these enemies, and he starts talking about Iran and North Korea as big targets. Now, this shifts dramatically because we have a war in Afghanistan and we go into Iraq in 2003, but right before you have this major shift towards Afghanistan, you do have North Korea being identified. And so let's go to the next slide. Hopefully I did this right. Why do we have this divide, right? So interdependence would say, oh, you have growing economic ties. Why don't you have growing, right, security alliances? And the first part is that this, for the same reason that the United States is weary about being dependent on foreign oil, South Korea is very worried about being dependent on American rice. And so they start making these arguments during this time period about food sovereignty, that we need to be able to get off of American rice, right? All states do this, right? All states do this, whether it's propaganda or rhetoric or whatever. All states say we should not be living off of resources from another state. Now, we want trade, right? We all want global trade, right? For those of you, right, who haven't really seen this, right, if we trade things globally, it makes a larger economy, right? It produces wealth, right? There's a lot of things, a lot of positives to this. Now, it can be exploited, which we'll talk about in the global south when we do IPE. But, right, as a state, you're always worried that you're becoming too reliant. So South Korea wants to have food sovereignty. They want to grow their own food, right? They realize that they're too dependent on American rice. The other thing is that part of the reason that South Korea is in this position is it had this very rapid population growth with very limited agricultural growth. So it was just rice becomes this vital resource. They don't want to rely on the US for this resource, but they're still not catching up during this time period of producing their own food. The other part, which is very unique to South Korea, is that 2/3 of the population of the country live in the capital of Seoul. So 2/3 of South Korea's population lives in the capital. The capital is very close to the border with North Korea. North Korean artillery is in range of Seoul, right? And artillery, I mean like big cannons, right? For lack of a more militarized term. I don't want to get too technical, but I also don't remember the exact models of the artillery pieces. So these artillery pieces can fire on the city of Seoul, which means 2/3 of the population of South Korea is at risk. North Korea and South Korea never had a true peace accord, and they at times have wanted to reunify, right? North Korea and South Korea were split by the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, there are still some calls for reunification, but the other concern is that the US can start making claims about how negatively they are viewing North Korea without risk, whereas South Korea is always thinking about this, right? So the Republic of Korea, the government of South Korea, denounces US language. So during this 2001 to 2007 period, this geopolitical factors start to dominate instead of the interdependence. So even though you have a larger amount of trade growing in 2001 to 2007, you have these other arguments of realism and geopolitics driving this factor. The next case is the Philippines. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. One of the reasons that we see this is that you don't have alignment, right? It's working in the opposite direction as we've expected. So you have an increase in trade, you have a decrease in security alliance, where the US administrations are not getting along with the Philippines. And then after 9/11, you have a decline in trade, but you have an increase in security alliances. And very clearly here, it's not about interdependence, right? Because trade is in decline. It's more about counterterrorism efforts. And then what we see in the Philippines, right, Duterte was and is sort of causing these very negative issues. But the US after 9/11 starts aligning with what they call strongmen, authoritarian regimes, right? Mubarak was supported by the Bush administration because it was more important to find these leaders who were very forceful and could end sort of terrorist threats than to, right, re-engage economically and have it tied to their economic dependence about how much they provided security, right? You wanted to prop up these authoritarian regimes so they would go after terrorists, and it didn't matter as much as if your economics were at risk, because the goal was to eliminate terrorists more than it was to maintain a strong economy. The next case is Taiwan. You again, right, you have a difference, right? You have a decline in economic dependence, but an increase in security alliance in 85 to 96. And then in 97 to 2000, you actually have an increase in economic ties, but then the Clinton administration, a very cosmopolitan administration, a very sort of global citizen administration, Bill Clinton was very much about engaging with the entire world, actually gives these three no's, right? There will be no independent Taiwan, right? Taiwan is part of China. There will not be two Chinas, right? We're not going to recognize Taiwan. So these three no's is all about not recognizing Taiwanese independence and not allowing Taiwan to become a separate government. But then in 2001 to 2007, right, the Bush administration starts blocking China. In the early 2000s, the Chinese economy starts growing to a point where you have Republicans in the United States saying we need to stop China from becoming too powerful. And so you have this alignment between the Bush administration and Taiwan because they're trying to block China, because they're trying to hold up this issue. The problem here is when you use this case is that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan is officially part of China. It's a very weird, opaque policy. But when you have these issues, using Taiwan as a case is very complicated, because if you have a security agreement with Taiwan, it's like having a security agreement with China that's also against Chinese interests, right? Because China eventually wants to reabsorb Taiwan. And so when you have a security alliance with Taiwan, you're saying, oh, I'm going to help China, but I'm going to help it against China. So it's very problematic using this Taiwanese case for this article, in this reason that it's not a state and security agreements are between states. The next case is Japan. So the Japanese economy grows very rapidly in the 80s. It actually becomes one of these things that's what's called an Asian tigers. So these East Asian tigers become this major argument for growth, right? That South Korea uses import substitution and industrialization because of Japan for the same reason. But what you notice is that you have a growing economy for a lot of these states, but as their economies grow, the security losses decline. So this opposing factors goes against the expansion of interdependence. In 96, you see the first bubbles, the Asian financial crisis. So the Japanese economy goes down and becomes very dependent on the US economically. But despite this increased economic dependence, you see the US saying, okay, well, I don't need you as much, you're not producing as much, but I'm going to increase my security alliance. In part, you see you have a recommitment to sort of protecting that area. And then, of course, the post 9/11 era, which we've talked about a couple times, you will notice at the end, I will talk about why this is sort of a problem. After 9/11, so many things change that counterterrorism policy becomes the argument, and economic interests sort of fall apart. So realism becomes dominant, the security issues, right, and the preemptive strikes of realism, these arguments about being self-help, they come out a lot from the US after 9/11. So when we're going through this article follows this process, right? Introduces a theory, and then it goes through these 4 cases, and the 4 cases do not support the conventional wisdom. The more important things that we see are ISI, which is import substitution, industrialization, and geopolitics, right? Even if there's this really strong interdependent economic tie between South Korea and the US, if the United States starts antagonizing North Korea, right, South Korea has to make a point of distancing itself because its population is at risk, because its population is an artillery range, right, of the North Korean military. When you have this, the reason why this is problematic is because the smaller states are always worried about these asymmetrical alliances, right? You have the great powers of the US and then whoever else we're using, there aren't a lot of great powers today, and then these smaller states. And the smaller states are always worried about asymmetrical alliances. Am I becoming so dependent on this foreign power that I don't have a way to defend myself, right? Costa Rica is one of the few states that does not have a standing military, right? Japan is not supposed to have an army, but it has a civil defense force, and its civil defense force is stronger than most militaries. So when you're too reliant on a great power, what happens when that great power doesn't come to your aid, right? So that's the real argument they're making, why realism matters for this type of belief, is that independence is great, independence might be helpful, but it might be chronologically out of order, that you have an ally and then you start trading more, or, right, interdependence might be false because if you become too tight economically, you might have a concern that you're not protecting your national interests, and so you might actually distance yourself from that state, from that trade partner politically. So they make a really good point about how interdependence fits with a liberal theory but not a realist theory, and then they give cases in which interdependence doesn't hold very well in those 4 cases. When you're reading an article, remember that these are people that are writing this, so they can make mistakes, they can give arguments that we don't agree with. Now, I'm not saying that you should disagree with this article. I'm saying you should think about what they're arguing. Did the authors refute the conventional wisdom? No, right? And you can disagree and you can make your own arguments, but we don't see a statistical analysis that shows that interdependence doesn't work. Well, we have 4 cases in which it doesn't fit. Are these 4 deviant cases, or is this the new standard? Is the theory flawed, or did it just show 4 exceptions? Is it problematic because the exceptions you showed, one was not a state and almost all of them dealt with 9/11, right? The data research ends pretty early, so maybe today we might have a new period that reinforces their argument. What evidence do the authors use? The evidence, right, you have case studies, and this case studies can be objective or intersubjective. So a case study is when you take a specific country or a specific time period and you discuss it. So they're using an objective, what they argue is an objective standpoint. So objective being that it was 26% of GDP, that the trade was 26% of GDP, or that, you know, 40% of their international commerce comes from the United States. Those are quantitative measures, they're objective. But then when they're talking about these states, they introduce this intersubjective ontology, right? When they talk about differing on policy, that's intersubjective, right? This idea that we can all share this understanding of what it means to differ in policy. So they're using case studies, but and times with two different ontologies. And you want to make sure you pick your ontology, you pick your epistemology when you're writing your art, when you're writing your paper, and you sort of want to stick to it. So these are all the things you want to think about. Probably tomorrow or in the next week, you should see a specific video just on the paper. For now, make sure you watch this. You will see assignment 8 today, and thank you for watching.